He boarded the plane thinking it would be just an ordinary flight. But a chance seatmate changed everything. In a single moment, a simple journey turned into a passage through fear, passion, betrayal, and the struggle for the right to be himself. A story of love that knows no borders, but demands courage against a world that condemns. I never thought a routine flight could carry so much weight, but that afternoon in the crowded terminal, everything felt strangely charged. My name is John, and until that day, I was just another student from a small town, someone who carried his life in a single backpack and a handful of expectations. I was traveling to New York for reasons that seemed straightforward: studies, opportunities, the usual story of a young man chasing something larger than his hometown could ever provide. I told myself it was just another trip, but in the pit of my stomach there was an unease I couldn't explain, as if the universe had conspired to place me on that plane for a reason I hadn't yet discovered. The terminal was alive with noise. Rolling suitcases, boarding calls, the impatient shuffle of travelers who seemed far more seasoned than I was. I stood in line, clutching my boarding pass a little too tightly, trying not to show how nervous I felt about flying. My family had waved me off at the bus station that morning, their words echoing in my ears, some encouraging, some doubtful, all of them tangled with the complicated feelings of leaving home behind. I told myself to focus on the journey ahead, on the city that represented freedom and possibility. And then I noticed him. At first, it was nothing more than a glance, a shape moving through the crowd with a kind of calm confidence that contrasted sharply with the nervous energy I carried. He was older than me by a few years, maybe mid-20s, dressed casually, but with an ease that made him stand out without trying. He walked as though he belonged everywhere, the type of man whose presence seemed to claim the space around him without a single word. I felt my eyes linger a little too long, and when he turned his head, our gazes collided for the first time. It was only a second, maybe less, but it unsettled me. His eyes didn't slide away quickly like most strangers would. They stayed, heavy, deliberate, as if he was weighing something about me he didn't yet understand. I dropped my gaze, pretending to adjust a strap on my bag, but I could still feel that brief exchange burning in the back of my mind. By the time I reached the gate and handed over my boarding pass, I had convinced myself I wouldn't see him again. Airports are full of fleeting encounters, people who brush past each other once and vanish forever. That's what I thought he would be. Yet, as I walked down the narrow aisle of the plane, searching for my seat, I froze for just a moment. There he was. Lucas, that's the name I would later learn, was already seated by the window in my row. He leaned back with a relaxed posture, one hand resting on the armrest, the other scrolling idly on his phone. There was something in the way he sat, not careless exactly, but composed in a manner that suggested he wasn't just waiting for the flight to start. He was observing, quietly aware of everything around him. When our eyes met again, this time without the distance of the terminal, the pull was immediate. "Looks like we're seatmates," he said, his voice calm, carrying just enough warmth to feel deliberate. I managed a nod, though my words stumbled on the way out. "Yeah, seems like it." Sliding into the seat beside him, I tried to ignore the sudden closeness. The cabin was cramped, as always, but the space between us felt smaller than it should have been. Every shift to his shoulder, every breath he drew, seemed to press against the edges of my awareness. I pulled the seatbelt across my lap, fastening it with more force than necessary, pretending that routine movements could disguise the way my heart had quickened. The plane filled with passengers around us, flight attendants moving briskly, voices echoing from the overhead speakers. But none of it seemed to matter as much as the man seated inches from me. I caught myself stealing glances at the way his jaw tensed when he focused, at the quiet curve of his mouth that looked like it could break into a smile at any second. He carried an energy I couldn't ignore, composed, self-assured, and yet strangely inviting. I told myself to focus on the in-flight magazine, flipping through pages without reading a single word. But it was impossible to escape the awareness of him beside me. Our arms never touched, yet I felt the heat of his presence, as if there were an invisible line connecting us. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was thick, charged like the pause before a storm breaks. Every small movement seemed to hold meaning. The way he adjusted his seat, the subtle glance in my direction, the faint smile that lingered as though he knew more than he was letting on. I shifted in my seat, trying to appear casual, though inside I was restless. What unsettled me most wasn't the attraction, though I couldn't deny that, but the intrigue. Who was he? Why did his presence feel less like coincidence and more like inevitability? As the plane taxied down the runway and the engines roared to life, I caught myself gripping the armrest tighter than usual. I hated turbulence, hated the feeling of being suspended in the sky without control. Normally, I would have shut my eyes and forced myself to breathe steadily, but this time was different. When the plane lifted into the air, I didn't think about the fear of flying. I thought about him. Lucas glanced at me then, his eyes dark, focused, but not unkind. It was the kind of look that felt like it could cut through the noise of the world and land squarely on you, holding you there with no escape. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. There was no conversation yet, only fragments. A question about whether I flew off and a comment about how long the line at security had been. Simple words, but each exchange stretched out, carrying an undertone I couldn't quite name. It wasn't flirting, not openly. It wasn't even familiarity. It was something else, something sharper, heavier, like standing too close to a flame and feeling the heat without touching it. I leaned back in my seat, telling myself I needed to stay calm. It was just a flight, just a stranger. Yet the air between us buzzed with a current I couldn't ignore. He didn't have to touch me, didn't have to lean in or say anything bold. His mere presence was enough to unravel me in ways I hadn't expected. Every time our eyes met, it felt like a challenge, like he was daring me to hold his gaze a second longer than was comfortable. I tried, sometimes, but inevitably I'd look away first, frustrated at myself for breaking the tension, while also relieved that it gave me a moment to steady my breath. Minutes passed like hours, the hum of the engines a backdrop to the silent game playing out between us. I didn't know what this was or where it was leading, but I knew one thing with certainty. This wasn't just a coincidence. Sitting beside Lucas was changing the way I felt about everything, the flight, the trip, maybe even myself. And that was only the beginning. The engines had settled into their steady hum, the kind of white noise that usually lulled me into a restless half-sleep. But this time, there was no chance of that. My thoughts were too alive, sharpened by the presence of the man beside me. For the first half hour, we exchanged nothing but brief, polite remarks, but the silence between those remarks felt loaded, as though we were circling around a conversation neither of us was ready to begin. I found myself stealing glances at him, hoping he wouldn't notice, but every time I looked away too quickly, I had the nagging sense that he had caught me in the act. Eventually, it was Lucas who broke the stillness. His voice was smooth, pitched low enough that it carried only to me above the drone of the cabin. So, he said casually, "Is New York home for you? Or just a stop along the way?" The question was ordinary enough, but the way he asked it made my heart pick up pace. I hesitated, weighing how much of myself I wanted to reveal to a stranger, but something about his tone loosened my guard. "Not home. Not yet. I'm starting university there," I said. "It's a bit overwhelming, if I'm honest. My hometown feels like another world compared to the city." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me as if he could read the unspoken words beneath mine. "Leaving home for the first time can feel like stepping off a cliff," he said. "But sometimes that's the only way to discover you can fly." I stared at him, startled by the unexpected depth of his answer. He wasn't just making conversation. He was reaching into something personal, and somehow it didn't feel intrusive. It felt like he saw through the thin mask I wore, the one I'd carried since boarding the bus that morning, pretending to be braver than I was. "Yeah," I said quietly, "that's exactly how it feels." We talked more after that, first about the surface things, where we grew up, what we were studying, the usual biographical sketches you give to strangers. But slowly, almost without realizing, I began telling him more than I'd intended. About how my parents had always wanted me to follow a safe path, how my friends back home didn't understand why I wanted to leave, how part of me feared I wasn't cut out for the city at all. What surprised me most was not that I said these things, but how easily he seemed to understand. He didn't offer cliché reassurances or pretend to have solutions. He just listened, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made it clear he wasn't thinking about what he'd say next. He was actually hearing me. And when he did speak, it was as if he had already walked the same uncertain roads I was describing. I know that feeling, he admitted after a pause. Try and make people proud while also trying to breathe. Sometimes the two don't go together. Sometimes you have to disappoint the people who raised you just to be honest with yourself. The words landed heavily in me, stirring something raw. How could he know so precisely what I was wrestling with when I hadn't spelled it out? I felt exposed, like he had peeled away layers I hadn't planned to show, but instead of shame, there was relief. I asked him then about his own life, turning the focus back on him. He smiled faintly, a guarded smile that suggested he was choosing his words carefully. I've moved around a lot, he said. Never stayed too long in one place. New York is familiar to me, but I wouldn't call it home. I don't really have one of those. His tone was calm, but something in it struck me as hollow, as though the casual phrasing concealed more than it revealed. A man like him, who carried himself with confidence, who spoke as if he understood everything. How could he not have a place he called home? I wanted to ask, to press further, but his eyes flicked toward the aisle for a brief second, as if warning me not to pry too deeply. Still, the intrigue gnawed at me. I was used to people who lived straightforward lives, who told their stories without hesitation. Lucas was different. Every time he gave me an answer, it felt like he had withheld the real one. And yet, despite the mystery, I felt drawn in. The hours slipped by as we spoke in hushed tones. I don't remember all the words, only the sensation of them, the way he made the cramped cabin seem like a world apart where only the two of us existed. It was unsettling, exhilarating, and strangely comforting all at once. I found myself telling him things I had never voiced aloud before, that I sometimes felt like a stranger in my own family, that I worried I would never truly belong anywhere, that I was afraid of who I was becoming. He never flinched, never judged. He only nodded, his eyes steady, and I felt for the first time in years that someone understood me. But every time I began to relax, to believe that this was a simple connection born out of chance, I caught something in his expression that unsettled me. A flicker in his gaze, a hesitation before his answers, a shadow that passed too quickly to name. It was like staring at a painting you couldn't quite interpret. You sensed a hidden meaning, but it refused to surface. At one point, as the cabin lights dimmed and most passengers settled into uneasy sleep, I asked him what he was going to New York for. He hesitated just long enough to make me notice. Work, he said finally. I'm meeting someone there. The answer was vague, and I sensed he intended it that way. I tried to press for details, but he deflected with a question about me, steering the conversation back as though he were weaving a dance I hadn't realized I was part of. His ability to redirect made me both frustrated and fascinated. The more he evaded, the more I wanted to know. What kind of work? Who was he meeting? Why did he sound like someone who carried secrets that couldn't be shared at cruising altitude with a stranger? The tension grew with each evasive turn, each pause heavy with meaning. I began to wonder if I was imagining it, if I was reading too much into the silences. But the feeling was undeniable. Lucas was not just another passenger killing time on a long flight. He was a man whose story was layered, complicated, perhaps even dangerous. And yet, in the middle of all the questions and uncertainties, I felt an unshakable pull toward him. It wasn't only attraction, though that was part of it. It was the sense that he saw me more clearly than anyone else ever had, and that in itself was intoxicating. When the plane cut through a patch of turbulence, I gripped the armrest instinctively. Lucas noticed and, without saying a word, leaned just slightly closer, not touching but close enough that I felt steadier. The gesture was so subtle, so unspoken, yet it carried more comfort than anything else could have in that moment. By the time the flight attendants began their final round through the cabin, I realized how deeply the hours had drawn us together. I knew more about him than I should have, and yet not nearly enough. I had shared more of myself than I ever intended, and yet felt strangely safe in having done so. Still, as the captain announced our descent, a chill ran through me. Because beneath the warmth of our exchange, beneath the connection that had formed so quickly, I knew with a certainty I couldn't explain, Lucas was carrying something he hadn't told me. Something that would matter. And though I didn't yet know what it was, I knew it would change everything. New York had always lived in my imagination as a city of bright beginnings, a place where the restless parts of me could finally breathe, where no one would care about who I was or what I carried. When the plane touched down, I felt a surge of possibility run through me, as if the very air of the city whispered that I was no longer bound by the weight of my small town. I stepped off that flight with Lucas at my side, and though nothing between us had been defined, the electricity of our connection still clung to me. I thought, foolishly, that this was a sign of something greater. The days that followed blurred together in the strange way that only new cities do. Crowded subways, tall buildings blotting out the sky, the endless noise that became both a distraction and a comfort. I threw myself into settling down, but in the back of my mind, Lucas lingered. We hadn't exchanged numbers at the airport, but by some unspoken pull, we found ourselves meeting again. A casual coffee at a corner shop turned into hours of talking. A walk through the streets turned into an evening I didn't want to end. He made the city feel less alien, and for the first time I believed I had found someone who understood me in ways even I couldn't explain. But the thing about miracles is that they often disguise themselves as traps. It happened on a night when the city was alive with its usual chaos, lights reflecting off wet pavement after a brief rain. I had been wandering with a few classmates when I saw him across the street. Lucas, standing at the entrance of a bar, laughing with a woman whose hand rested too easily on his arm. They looked close, intimate in a way that felt rehearsed, as if this wasn't the first time. My chest tightened as I watched them. At first I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that he was just friendly, that I was overreacting. But then I saw it. The way he leaned toward her, the way her smile deepened as he whispered something in her ear. It was like a crack splitting open in the foundation of everything I had built in my mind. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I stood frozen, the noise of traffic blurring into a hollow roar as the scene burned itself into my memory. I felt foolish, naive, like a child who had believed in a storybook only to discover the ink had been smeared. When I finally turned away, I did so with a hollow weight pressing against my ribs. The confrontation came later, when I could no longer carry the silence. He didn't deny it. He admitted with unsettling calmness that he was seeing her, that he had been with women for years, and that what happened between us, what I thought was extraordinary, was for him just another hidden corner of a life he refused to name out loud. "You don't understand," he said, his voice steady, but his eyes darting as though he was speaking more to himself than to me. "It's not that simple. I can't just live openly. People wouldn't accept it. She doesn't know, no one does. That's how it has to be." The words struck me like stones. I wanted to shout, to demand why he had let me believe our connection meant more, but all I could manage was a hoarse whisper. "So what was I to you then? An accident? A distraction? Just a secret you can pack away when it's inconvenient?" He didn't answer right away, and his silence was answer enough. In that moment, everything shifted. The warmth of our conversations, the hours spent feeling seen for the first time, all of it curdled into something sour. I had given him trust without hesitation, and in return, I was handed nothing but shadows. I left him there, standing with excuses half-formed on his lips, and walked into the night with a kind of numbness that felt worse than anger. But betrayal has a way of echoing. It doesn't stop at the person who wounded you. It seeps into the cracks of everything else you thought was solid. It was only days later when the second blow came. A phone call from home, my mother's voice tight and trembling, my father's silence louder than any words. Somehow, through whispers in town or a carelessly left message, they had discovered what I hadn't yet spoken to them myself, the truth about who I was. The conversation unraveled like a rope pulled too tight. My mother begged me to tell her it wasn't true, to say it was a phase, a mistake, anything that would fit into the narrow frame of the life they had imagined for me. My father's voice finally broke through, cold and heavy. "You're throwing everything away. Do you know what people will say about us? About you?" I wanted to explain, to make them understand that this wasn't about shame, that it was about finally breathing without suffocating. But the words died in my throat. All I heard was their disappointment. All I felt was the weight of their judgment pressing against wounds that were already raw. When the call ended, I sat in my tiny apartment staring at the city lights flickering outside the window. I felt as though I was being crushed between two walls. On one side, a man who had made me believe in connection only to shatter it with lies, and on the other, a family who would rather erase who I was than accept me. The city that once promised freedom now felt like a cage, its vastness mocking my isolation. I walked the streets for hours, watching strangers brush past me with indifference, each of them carrying lives I couldn't touch. Somewhere in the crowd, Lucas lived his double life, smiling with her, hiding with me, and I couldn't decide which hurt more, the betrayal itself or the realization that he would never pay the price of it. That weight was mine alone. Yet beneath the pain, a small flame of defiance began to stir. Because if he could lie to himself forever, and if my parents could chain themselves to their narrow beliefs, then maybe the only choice left for me was to refuse both prisons. The betrayal cut deep. The judgment nearly broke me. But somewhere in the quiet ache of those nights, I began to understand. Pain has a way of carving space. And maybe, just maybe, that space could be the beginning of something stronger than the walls that closed in on me. The days after everything collapsed blurred into each other like rain streaks on a window pane, indistinguishable, heavy, and unrelenting. I moved through New York with the hollow precision of someone carrying too much weight inside, my body going through motions while my mind crumbled in silence. Everywhere I went, the betrayal clung to me like a second skin. Lucas's voice, his calm justifications, his evasions, they replayed in my head until I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. And my parents' words, sharper than any blade, echoed even louder. Disappointment, shame, rejection. Their silence afterward, their refusal to call back, pressed against me like a verdict. I tried to bury myself in routine, telling myself that work and studies would distract me, but the city itself seemed determined to confront me at every turn. The couples walking hand in hand down the avenues, the laughter that spilled out of coffee shops, even the sight of people comfortable in their own skin, it all felt like a provocation. As if the universe was asking me, why not you? Why do you hide? Why do you flinch? Why do you let the voices of others drown out your own? One night, unable to sleep, I wandered down Christopher Street, following the sound of music spilling from a bar I'd passed countless times without entering. The rainbow flags above the door caught in the wind, bright against the night sky, like colors I had denied myself for too long. I didn't intend to go in, but my feet betrayed me, carrying me across the threshold into a world pulsing with energy, defiance, and a freedom I had never dared to claim. Inside, the air was thick with laughter, conversation, and the kind of ease that comes when people no longer apologize for who they are. I stood at the edge, an intruder watching lives unfold that seemed impossibly distant from my own. But then someone noticed me. A guy about my age, with easy eyes and a knowing smile, approached without hesitation. "First time here?" he asked. I tried to deny it, but my hesitation was answer enough. He laughed softly, not unkindly, and introduced himself, Eli. Within minutes, he had drawn me into a circle of friends, each of them strangers yet strangely familiar. They asked questions, not prying but curious, and they listened in a way that felt worlds apart from the judgment I'd grown used to. At first, I kept my answers short, hiding behind the same defenses I'd carried for years. But as the night stretched on, something shifted. I admitted pieces of my truth, the betrayal, the fear, the suffocating weight of my parents' expectations. I expected their faces to harden, for silence to fall heavy between us. Instead, they nodded, some even smiling with a kind of sad recognition. They told their own stories. The brother who refused to speak to them for years, the friend who turned away, the family dinners that ended in shouting matches. Their pain was woven into the fabric of their resilience. And for the first time I realized I wasn't as alone as I had believed. Over the next weeks, they became my anchor. Eli especially, with his quiet determination to remind me that betrayal did not define me. He would drag me out for coffee when I wanted to disappear, send messages late at night when the silence became unbearable, and challenge me when I fell back into self-blame. He lied, John. That's on him, not you. Don't carry his shame. Those words struck deep because I'd been doing exactly that, carrying Lucas's duplicity as if it were my burden. But letting go of that weight was not simple. Every time I passed a street corner that reminded me of him, every time I heard laughter that echoed too closely to his, I felt the wound reopen. And beneath that wound was the deeper scar of my parents' rejection, the ache of knowing that the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally had chosen silence instead. There were nights when I wondered if they were right, if I was doomed to live a life defined by disappointment and secrecy. It was during one of those nights, sitting on the roof of Eli's building with the city lights spread out below us, that I finally voiced the thought I had been hiding even from myself. Maybe I don't deserve to be happy, I said, the words tasting like ash as they left me. Eli didn't look away. That's exactly what they want you to believe. Him, your parents, anyone who can't handle the truth of you. But listen, John, you don't have to earn the right to exist as yourself. You already deserve it. Something inside me cracked then, not broken but breaking open. I realized how much of my life had been spent trying to meet standards that were never mine to begin with. The betrayal with Lucas had hurt not only because he lied, but because I had measured my worth by how he treated me. My parents' rejection burned because I had built my identity on their approval. All of it was borrowed, fragile, conditional. And for the first time, I began to wonder what it would mean to build a life on my own terms. That didn't mean the pain vanished. It didn't mean I stopped longing for my parents' voices or stopped dreaming about the connection I had once believed in with Lucas. But slowly, through the voices of those who stood beside me, I learned that pain did not erase possibility. The betrayal, the rejection, they were not the end of my story, but the fire that could forge a different beginning. I started writing again, filling notebooks with thoughts I had never dared to put into words. I joined small gatherings, community events, spaces where my voice did not feel like an intrusion, but a contribution. Each step was small, tentative, but each step reminded me that I was no longer running for myself. Looking back, I understood something I hadn't seen before. Lucas's betrayal, as devastating as it was, had been a catalyst. If he had been honest, if he had chosen me openly, maybe I would have hidden in the comfort of that connection, never learning to stand on my own. And my parents' rejection, as painful as it remained, had pushed me into the arms of a community that taught me resilience. Their absence left a void, but in that void, new voices rose. Voices that told me I was not broken, not alone, not unworthy. Even now, the city sometimes feels overwhelming, and the ache of loss still whispers at the edges of my days. But I no longer confuse betrayal with destiny or rejection with truth. I know now that love, real love, cannot live in shadows. And even if I have yet to find it, I have found something just as vital, myself. The city had already begun to change for me by the time Lucas reappeared, though I hadn't noticed it until that moment. The streets no longer felt like hostile mazes. They were paths I had started to claim, slowly, step by step. The friends I had made reminded me that life could be lived openly, and though the pain of betrayal still lingered, I had begun to carry it differently. It was no longer a wound that bled freely. It had become a scar, one that reminded me of where I'd been, but no longer dictated where I was going. And then one evening, as if the universe were testing me, he found me. It was outside a small cafe where I had been studying, the kind of unassuming place where I could disappear for hours. I had just stepped out into the cool night air when I saw him leaning against the lamppost across the street. For a moment, I thought I had conjured him out of memory, a ghost of a story I had already buried. But then he lifted his head, and his eyes found mine. "John," he said, his voice cutting through the noise of passing cars. My chest tightened at the sound, but I held my ground. He crossed the street with that same easy confidence that had once disarmed me, But now I recognized it for what it was. A mask, a performance rehearsed over years. "I've been trying to reach you," he said quickly, his words tumbling over each other as if afraid I might turn away. "You won't answer my messages. I need to talk to you." I could have walked away then. I could have left him standing there in the shadows of his own choices. But something inside me, perhaps the need for closure, compelled me to stay. "Talk then," I said, my voice colder than I intended. He hesitated, his usual composure faltering. "I made a mistake," he admitted. "I should have been honest with you from the start. But what we had, it was real. You felt it too. I can't just pretend it didn't happen." His words twisted in me, stirring the ache I thought I had tamed. For a brief second, I remembered the nights on the plane, the conversations that had felt like lifelines. But the memory was tainted now, corrupted by the knowledge of his lies. "What we had," I said slowly, "was built on half-truths. You wanted me in the shadows, hidden away while you smiled for the world with her. That wasn't love. That was convenience." He flinched as if I had struck him, and for the first time I saw the cracks in his armor. His voice wavered when he spoke again. "I was scared. You don't know what it's like, the pressure, the expectations. I thought I could manage both, but I was wrong. Please, I don't want to lose you." Something inside me hardened. For months, I had carried the shame of his deception, the weight of my parents' judgment, the fear of being alone. But now, standing in front of him, I realized the truth. The only way I could lose myself was by going back to him. "You already lost me," I said, my voice steady now, stronger than I had ever heard it. "And not because you chose her, but because you chose lies. I won't live in someone else's shadow. I won't let myself be diminished so you can feel safe in a double life." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout could have been. His eyes darted away, then back, searching for a crack in my resolve. There was none. For the first time, Lucas looked small. The man who had once seemed untouchable, magnetic, now stood unraveling before me. I could see the weight of his choices pressing down on him, the realization that his lies had left him with nothing solid to hold on to. He tried to speak again, but the words died before they reached me. "Goodbye, Lucas," I said, and I meant it. I turned then, walking away without looking back. Each step felt like reclaiming something I had lost. The dignity he had tried to take from me, the voice my parents had tried to silence, the belief that I deserved more than secrets and shame. The night air was sharp against my skin, but instead of feeling cold, I felt alive. As I reached the end of the block, I allowed myself one final glance over my shoulder. He was still there, standing alone under the lamppost, swallowed by the shadows. In that image, I saw everything I needed to understand. Lucas would remain trapped in his double life until he chose otherwise, but I no longer had to share his prison. His consequences were his alone to bear. In the days that followed, something inside me shifted completely. For the first time, I stopped waiting for permission from him, from my parents, from anyone to live as myself. I attended gatherings without fear, introduced myself without hesitation, and spoke my truth without apology. It wasn't always easy. The scars of rejection don't vanish overnight. But each time I refused to bow to shame, each time I chose honesty over silence, I felt the chains loosen a little more. I began to see that hope was not a destination, but a decision. Freedom was not given, it was claimed. And dignity was not something others bestowed. It was something I carried within me, unshaken by the storms of betrayal or the weight of disapproval. That was the first real step into my new life. Not with Lucas at my side, not with my parents' blessing, but with myself, whole, unashamed, and unafraid of the road ahead. The past would always be part of me, but it no longer defined me. What defined me now was the choice to rise from it, to walk forward with my head held high, into a future that was mine alone.